So we've been taking a look at Descartes' foundationalist approach to building up his knowledge, where he thinks, look, what I need is one certain thing that I cannot possibly doubt that will serve as the foundation upon which I can build up all of my other beliefs. And as long as I'm really careful, as long as I start with a foundation that I can't possibly doubt, I think, therefore I am, then everything I build on top of that foundation will also be certain and something that I can't possibly doubt. So if I can find some more building blocks to go in the middle of my tower, I can finally build up so that at the top of my tower of knowledge, I can be absolutely certain that the beliefs I build up there, like my belief that I have a body, the belief that space and time exists, that all of those things will also be certain and not possibly open for doubt either. Of course, the challenge here is to figure out, well, what goes in that middle area there? What are those middle building blocks? How do you get from, I think, therefore I am, to, I'm also certain that my body exists? And that's what Descartes tries to do in the third and fourth meditations, and that's what I asked you to try and struggle through in your assignment this past week, is to try and figure out, what building blocks is he putting in the middle part of his tower? Now, I'll warn you that lots of philosophers have disagreed about just exactly what Descartes' reasoning is here in the third and fourth meditations, and many philosophers have struggled with trying to characterize just what his reasoning is. So if you found yourself frustrated and not entirely sure what his reasoning is, you're in really good company. You are just like lots of philosophers throughout history who have struggled to figure out exactly what Descartes' reasoning is. So I'm not looking for any particular right or wrong answer here, but what I want to see is that you thought carefully about it and came up with something plausible. So Descartes is using this idea of a deductively valid argument that we learned about the other week to try and build up these beliefs from his certain premises, I think, therefore I am, and trying to come to conclusions about new things, like, I have a body. And the first thing that he does in the third meditation seems to be something like the following. He realizes, I can be absolutely certain that I think, and therefore I exist, because something's got to be doing that thinking, and that's me. I am the thing doing the thinking. And then he realizes in the third meditation, well, look, how am I so certain that I'm a thinking thing? Well, I just clearly and distinctly perceive it. Nothing could be more clear to me. And so he seems like maybe what he then concludes from those two premises is, everything I clearly and distinctly perceive must be true. Now, already you can see here, if you ask yourself, is this a valid argument? Is it the case that if both of those premises are true, the conclusion must be true? No, it's not. So if this is the way that Descartes is reasoning about things, already off the bat, he's just, kind of blown it, because that's not a valid argument. Even if the premises are true, that doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion is true. But let's give him this one. It's a bogey for now. So here's how he seems to flesh out this idea. Once he thinks that he can take it for granted that everything he clearly and distinctly perceives it exists. So he seems to reason, so everything I clearly and distinctly perceive exists. Well, I clearly and distinctly perceive a bunch of ideas. I've got an idea of my body, I've got an idea of horses and cows, and I have an idea of God. Now, those ideas exist. I know that I'm thinking about horses and cows, but I can't just conclude from there that horses and cows themselves actually exist. So that doesn't help me kind of come to a conclusion right away about whether my body exists. But let's focus on my idea of God. So I know that I have an idea of God, and then the question is whether there's an actual God that exists independently of my idea of God. Well, so that's when he comes into the third premise, and he thinks, so not only do I clearly and distinctly perceive this idea of God, I clearly and distinctly perceive that there must be as much reality in the cause as in the effect. And so here is where he's getting into all this stuff about how perfect and infinite God is. So Descartes' thought process seems to be something like the following. Well, look, I've got these ideas of horses and cows and what have you. Now, those are all ideas of things that are finite and imperfect. Just like me, I'm a finite and imperfect creature. So I guess it's plausible, it's possible at any rate, that I myself could have created the ideas of horses and cows, even if actual horses and cows don't exist, because I'm imperfect and finite, so sure, I could generate ideas of things that are imperfect and finite, just like I can generate the idea of Santa Claus or the idea of a centaur, even though those things don't actually exist. But my idea of God is an idea of a very different sort of thing. My idea of God is an idea of something that is perfect and infinite. And yet I, myself, I'm not perfect. I'm not infinite. So, since I can clearly and distinctly perceive that there must be as much reality in the cause as in the effect, Descartes reasons, well, all right, so that idea of a perfect, infinite thing, that cannot come from me, because my reality is one that is imperfect and finite, but the reality of my idea of God is of something that's infinite and perfect. So I couldn't have come up with the idea of something that's perfect and infinite. Therefore, since God is perfect and infinite, the source of my idea of God must be God himself. So now I can conclude that because I have an idea of this God that's perfect and infinite, God himself must exist as something that's perfect and infinite. So now I can come to a conclusion about something else that exists. Not only do I exist, and not only does my mind exist, God must also exist as well. Not only my idea of God, but God himself. Well, okay, if God exists, I can also reflect and realize that I clearly and distinctly perceive that God isn't going to deceive me about things that I clearly and distinctly perceive. And so since I clearly and distinctly perceive that God's not going to deceive me, I can be certain that God won't deceive me about that stuff. And now we're off to the races, because now all I need to do is realize, oh yeah, well, I clearly and distinctly perceive that I have a body. So since God exists, God wouldn't deceive me about that. So therefore, I must have a body. My body must exist. So let's take the reasoning that I just went over here in this argument and condense it down to just the highlights. It seems like one way to reconstruct how Descartes is thinking about things is to say that he reasons, look, everything I clearly and distinctly perceive exists. I can conclude that God exists, and God doesn't deceive me about things I clearly and distinctly perceive. So everything I clearly and distinctly perceive exists. And then we can just take that conclusion and feed it into some other premises, namely that I clearly and distinctly perceive my body, and then therefore conclude, aha, my body exists.